Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Just before we get started, I want to remind you that we are going to ask you to pop your questions into the Q&A, not the chat. You're welcome to chat amongst yourselves, but if you have any questions for Kathrin during this webinar, she is going to be pausing throughout to address any questions sort of about what she's doing as we go along. If you have any general questions, still pop them into the Q&A and we will have time at the end to go over those. So before we get started, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I am Jen Casey. I am the academic advisor at the Vancouver campus. And tonight we have Kathrin Brunner with us and her husband, Andrew. So Kathrin is a faculty member at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition. She teaches nutrition and the environment and psychology of disease. So she and her partner, Andrew Hodge, have been running For the Love of Body since 2013, teaching a variety of hands-on workshops that focus on sustainable living and holistic health. They've taught thousands of people how to ferment foods, make natural skincare products, and wildcraft with local herbs. Kathrin is a certified nutritional practitioner who has studied sustainable agriculture and permaculture design. She has extensively studied microbial ecosystems and their interaction with human health. Andrew is an accomplished fermenter with a background in the restaurant industry. So Kathrin does have an upcoming continuing education course. It runs on 4 Wednesday evenings. It's June 1st, 8th, 15th, and 22nd. And you can sign up for it through the Institute of Holistic Nutrition website. So Kathrin and Andrew, I will hand it over to you. Remember to pop any of your questions into the Q&A, and we will pause throughout to address them during the webinar and again after. Have fun.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone who's able to join us. We're excited to have you here. Tonight, we're going to be making a sauerkraut, and it's our Dilly Kraut, which is one of our most popular recipes. And hopefully some of you have the recipe card and you're going to be making it along with us. If you don't have the ingredients, if you're going to be making it later, you can watch along with us. And then when you have a chance to gather the ingredients, you know exactly what you're doing. As we go through and make the kraut, as Jen said, we're going to pause so that we can see if there's any questions on what we've just done, and then we'll move on to the next step. So don't feel like you're going to need to rush. We'll take our time to get everything prepared and made. Andrew's going to be helping me prep and make things tonight because I don't like multitasking with a knife. So we've got our materials laid out and we have our ingredients laid out. We have a cabbage, we have cucumbers, we have salt, we have our fresh dill, and we also have some fresh garlic. In terms of equipment that we need, cutting board, a knife, and a bowl is what we'll need for the prep. And then when we get to putting our sauerkraut into containers, we've just got glass jars. And this could be any type of clean glass jar from your kitchen. We happen to have mason jars or canning jars. It could be any type of clean jar. If you have a jar that had spaghetti sauce in it, as long as you've cleaned it with hot water and soap, you can also use that. That's perfectly fine. To get started, for our cabbage, the first thing that we want to do is peel away the outer leaves. And those outer leaves will be discarded into the compost bin. And then once you get the outer leaves removed, you want to cut off the bottom of the stem and any areas where there might be visible damage or mold on cabbage. So that would be cut away and removed. And then once you get to the clean leaves on the inside, we're going to remove one leaf and set it aside, and we're going to use that again later. So outer leaves, they get discarded. Once you get to the inside of the cabbage, which would be the clean part of the cabbage, that's going to be where we take a leaf, remove it, and set it aside. And then once you get to that inside of the cabbage, then we're going to start to slice it for our kraut. And depending on the size of the cabbage will depend on how many cuts that you take. But you're going to want to do at least a cut in half, cutting through the root end. So wherever the stem end was on the bottom of the cabbage, you'll slice right through it. And then if you've got a smaller cabbage, then that might be the only cut that you make, and you might start to just slice it very thinly. If you have a really big cabbage, then you might quarter it, cutting it again through that stem end. Okay. And then cut side down, and we're going to start to thinly slice the cabbage. Now, in general, of course, when you're fermenting sauerkraut, it's really up to you how you slice it. You could also chop it or dice it. If it's your first time making kraut, I'm going to recommend for this recipe doing really thin slices or thin strips. For me, I think that creates a really nice texture to the final sauerkraut. It also lends itself really easily for using in different types of recipes as a condiment or something that you might be adding to a salad or on top of a wrap or a sandwich or something like that. So I'll just pick up here one of the strips just so you kind of get a sense of how thin we're cutting it. So just a fairly thin slice. And then Andrew here is just slicing out the bottom of the stem. And that can actually get set aside with the cabbage leaf, the clean one that you reserved. Now, as you start to slice those cabbage leaves up, they can start to go into your bowl. And when we are fermenting different types of vegetables, what we're doing is allowing the natural microbes that are already on the vegetables to be doing the fermentation for us. And so when we're taking something like our cabbage and we're allowing it to ferment, we're using Lactobacillus Bacteria. And those bacteria are called Lactobacillus because they create lactic acid. And sometimes we might shorten that to be called LAB for lactic acid bacteria. And those bacteria are what ferment vegetables for us. And when those bacteria start to feed on the carbohydrates that are in the cabbage and the rest of the vegetables that we're fermenting, they turn those sugars into lactic acid. And that lactic acid is what gives fermented foods their characteristic tanginess or that sourness that we associate with fermented foods. And that's also what ultimately preserves the food for us. Now, Andrew's got the sliced cabbage in the bowl, and this is where we're going to now start to add sea salt. And on your recipe card, we gave a rough recommendation for an amount of sea salt, but this is really where it's by taste. So for one, the texture of your salt really makes a difference. If you're using coarse sea salt versus fine sea salt, the amount of salt in a teaspoon is going to vary greatly. You also depends on how much cabbage you actually have. So a small cabbage versus a very large cabbage. So we had a medium-sized cabbage. So Andrew's going to start with about 1.5 teaspoons of sea salt, and he's just going to sprinkle that into the bowl. And then we're going to start to massage that cabbage. And when we're massaging the salt into the cabbage, we're doing a couple things with the salt. One thing that we're doing is we're using the salt to pull the water out of the cabbage. And that's ultimately going to make a brine. And brine just means salty water. And when we're doing a kraut style of ferment, we don't add water to it instead we use the salt to remove the water from the cabbage. And there's many types of fermented vegetables that benefit from doing this style, especially if the vegetable has a high water content, because salt will always pull water out. And so if we were adding salty water to this cabbage, that salty water is going to keep pulling water out of the cabbage, and that will dilute the brine. And we want to have a certain amount of salt. So by allowing the salt to pull the water out of the cabbage, you end up creating the ultimate saltiness that you want in the end of your ferment. The other thing that the salt does is it helps to inhibit an enzyme that makes the vegetables become soft. And so by putting salt into your kraut, you also help to have a crunchier texture in the end. And for me, that's actually something in terms of like palate and flavor that's really important. For me, it's a much nicer mouthfeel if there's a bit of texture and crunch to the final kraut. And certainly I think for a lot of people, if you're not very familiar with sauerkraut, I think sometimes we think we don't like sauerkraut, especially if we've only bought commercial stuff from the store, which is often not fermented, but rather it's pickled in vinegar. Or if you've maybe only had, your great aunt's kraut, which is maybe overly fermented for a long time and has become quite soft, we might not really like the flavor of sauerkraut. And so certainly if this is your first time making it, it might be a really nice surprise how delicious and tasty and crunchy krauts can be. So our sea salt is helping to pull the water out of the vegetables. It's helping to keep some crunch texture in the end. And it's also helping to create a favorable environment where those lactic acid bacteria will be able to thrive, and other types of microorganisms like yeast, who would turn those sugars into alcohol, they don't like that salty environment. And I think often what we encounter when we're teaching people how to ferment is we might have a little bit of a fear of using too much salt. And I think for a lot of us, we maybe think that we need to really minimize how much salt is in our diet. And certainly if we're consuming processed foods, they can sometimes have high amounts of sodium in them. But when we're eating more unprocessed foods, we need salt in our diets. It's something that's very important for our overall health. And so it's important to add enough salt to your kraut and to not try and minimize how much salt that you add, because it's also helping to create that favorable environment for the microorganisms that we want to thrive, and the yeast, which in this type of ferment we don't want because they'll make alcohol, to not be able to thrive.
A little more.
Okay, and so at this stage, Andrew has massaged the salt into the cabbage, and he's just given it a bit of a taste test. And what you're looking for is something that's pleasingly salty. You want to taste the amount of salt that's in it. And so you don't want to shy away from it. It's not the amount of salt that you would put in a coleslaw. You want it to be saltier than that. Now, for salt, one of the questions that we also often get is, does it matter what kind of salt? We always prefer using natural sea salts, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that often in table salts or kosher salts, they'll add anti-clumping agents, and some of those anti-clumping agents can inhibit fermentation. So we prefer to use sea salts so that we're not introducing anything that might slow or change the way that it ferments. And then for sea salts, we also like that we have some trace minerals that are within those sea salts, which table salts tend to lack. And because we're creating a nice acidic environment here when we're creating these fermented foods, we also help to absorb some of those minerals that we're adding in that sea salt. So it's nice to add it. Now for massaging the kraut, I think the other thing that we can't possibly emphasize enough is that you actually really want to massage the salt into the cabbage. And what you're going to start to see, so if you're making this along with us, you're going to start to see that the cabbage becomes wet and translucent as the water is pulled out by the salt. And what you want is to really use your finger strength to massage the salt into the cabbage. And I often joke that it's a pretty good finger grip workout and a pretty good forearm workout. And you want to be able to do that because we need to create that brine. We need to extract the water so that we have a brine available for the fermentation. So Andrew's going to pick up some of the cabbage and just give it a squeeze so that you can see when Andrew squeezes it, the water that's pouring out. And that's a really good test. Can you pick up a handful of that Crout and give it a squeeze and have water pour out of it? The other thing that can be a good test is to just shift your Crout aside a little bit and see that you have a puddle of water in the bottom of your bowl. If that's not happening yet, you need to massage for longer to allow that salt to start to extract that water out. If you have a cabbage that's taking a long time to extract that sea salt, or to extract that water rather, sometimes I'll just let it rest for a little bit. I'll go off and do something else. I'll allow the salt to do its work of pulling water out, and then I'll come back to it and start massaging again. But really enough massaging time should allow you to create that puddle of water on the bottom. And maybe, Angie, you can just take the bowl up and just sort of show how much water we're looking for in the bottom of that bowl. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just take a quick pause here and see if there's any questions so far about getting to this stage of massaged cabbage with a puddle of brine.
Does anyone have any questions for Kathrin and Andrew? If you do, just type them into the Q&A and I will I'll let them know.
Okay,
I think we're good.
Okay, so when we have that pile of brine that's at the bottom of the bowl, now we can start to add some of our other ingredients. Now, if you are using fresh herbs, we're using fresh dill for this Dilly Kraut. For the dill, we're going to remove some of the stems that are at the bottom that are a little bit stiffer. And then we're going to just lightly chop or mince that fresh dill and then add it to the Crout. And I'm a really big fan of the flavor of fresh dill. And so I typically add quite a bit of dill to this to make it a very strong and prominent flavor. It's already smelling so good. And then if you are adding garlic, at this point you can peel your garlic. And for the garlic, you have a couple different options. You could mince the garlic finely. You could also, if you have a microplaner or a grater, you could also grate the garlic in. And if you're adding garlic, it's fermenter's choice. If you like really garlicky flavor with your dill, then you could add 1 to 2 cloves. If you want a milder flavor, then add a little bit less. I actually, for this, really like the dill to be very prominent. And so I'm not going to be adding garlic to this particular batch because I'm wanting it to just be a little bit more bright and fresh without the garlic in. But if you're adding the garlic, peel it, mince it, or grate it, and then you'll add it into your Crout and you'll just give it a little toss to allow that garlic flavor to start to move throughout.
What do you think? You want more?
Yeah, give that I think maybe a little bit more. Yeah. herbs go in, and then they get a little toss around. And then once you've got the garlic, if you're using it, and the herbs in there and tossed around, give it again another taste test. And just check and see, is that the amount of garlic that you like? Is that amount of herb that you like? Otherwise, you can add more if you want a stronger flavor of either one. Okay. And then for the last ingredient that we're putting in is cucumbers. And these are going in last because if you're still needing to massage to extract that water from the cabbage, you don't want your sliced cucumbers in there or they'll get bruised and damaged. And so these won't go in until the very end. You could dice them and have chunks of cucumbers. You could also slice them. We're using smaller cucumbers. If you've got a larger cucumber, then you could also cut it in half or quarter it, entirely up to you. Oh my gosh, it smells so fresh.
It's a good springtime Crout.
It's a great springtime kraut. It's got wonderful flavors in it. And then once you've got the cucumber chopped, it's going to go into the bowl and then everything gets a final toss. Isn't that right, Molly? Yeah. Right. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Right. Thank you. I can take it from here if you like.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so
Now,
much. Okay. Now we've got our kraut all ready to go. And if you're not at this stage yet, just go ahead and take your time. I'm going to start to talk a little bit about what's going to happen during the fermentation period so that we know how this is going to transform as it ferments and what these health benefits are of fermented foods, how they might be different from probiotic supplements, what they do for us when we eat them, and how we can think about integrating them into our diets. So if you're still massaging and prepping, just go ahead and get caught up. So right now, we just have some chopped cabbage and herbs and cucumbers in a bowl. And if we were to leave this out like this, within a few days, it's going to start to rot and go off. So one of the things that is just so fantastic about fermented foods is there's such a wonderful tool for preservation. Once we have this turned into a kraut, we can literally store it for several months and it is perfectly safe to eat. So certainly in terms of food preservation, if you're growing your own food, if you have a CSA, if you're trying to buy in season and locally, it can be a really great method for being able to buy things in season and then preserve them to last through the winter months. It's one of my favorite ways to preserve foods. And then when we have this fermentation process starting to happen, those lactic acid bacteria, as they create that lactic acid, that's going to ultimately be what preserves the vegetables for us. It's the pH change that it creates. And that lactic acid is what imparts that characteristic flavor to the food, but it's also what helps it to then be preserved, making it safe to eat. The other thing that starts to happen as those lactic acid bacteria are creating that lactic acid that preserves it is they're also starting to break the vegetables down. And we might say that that's a pre-digestion, right? Because when we're eating foods, it's ultimately our gut bacteria that's actually doing the digesting of foods for us. And so when we're already creating those microbes here in a fermented foods, they start to already do that pre-digestion. They start to break nutrients down. And that's something that's really important because that pre-digestion means it's going to be easier for us to digest it. And something like our cabbage family foods, these are incredibly healthy. Our garlic, it's incredibly healthy. They have lots of nutrients that are fantastic for liver health, for anti-inflammatory effects, for our overall health, but they're also really difficult to digest. I think most people, if you were to eat a large amount of brassica family or a large amount of raw onion or garlic, for many of us, it causes digestive distress. What's wonderful with fermented foods is it allows you to start to break some of those difficult to digest nutrients down so that you can eat them and not have any indigestion. And that pre-digestion also liberates nutrients. It makes it easier for your body to bioassimilate it. And so when we think again about all of these wonderful antioxidants and all of these wonderful nutrients that support our health in these wonderful foods, when we start to break them down through fermentation, it's easier for us to actually bioassimilate them and use them in our bodies. Now, the other thing that, of course, we're also creating when we ferment foods is those microbes. And those probiotic organisms, as they're moving through us, also have a transitory benefit, which means that they're doing good things as they make their way through us. And some of the things that they're doing that are beneficial is they're helping us to digest other things that we're eating. So for example, if I end up having a little bowl of this Dilly Kraut with my lunch, the other things that I'm eating for lunch will also benefit by being digested, that digestive process, with these probiotics that are in that Dilly Kraut. So they'll help me to digest the rest of the meal. They'll also interact with my immune system. And as it's moving through, that transitory benefit helps my immune system to be functioning better. And that's something that can be really wonderful to think about, especially if we are wanting to have anti-inflammatory properties, if we're wanting to support allergies, if we're wanting to support being able to fight infections. So all of those different benefits come from having that transitory benefit of probiotics moving through us. Now, once you've reached this stage of having that puddle, we're now going to start to pack our kraut into our jars. Now, I'm going to start with this larger jar. If you don't have a larger jar, that's also perfectly fine. You could be using several smaller jars. And if you've got something like a canning funnel, that can work really well for just making it a little bit less messy. But if you don't have one, that's also totally fine. I'm just going to start to take the kraut and start to put it into the jar. And if you're doing this along with me, you're going to fill the jar maybe about a third of the way or so, and then pause. And then using your hand, or you might use something like a tool, like a muddler or the back of a spoon, or if you have a tamper for your blender, that also works really well. But we're going to want to press down on our kraut to eliminate any big air pockets. And this is one of the reasons why I like these wider mouth jars at the top, because it makes it easier for me to fit my hand right inside and press down. Otherwise, you're using your tool and you're just pushing down to eliminate any big air pockets. And then once you've done that, continue to fill, and you'll do that a few times, filling up and then pausing, packing it down again to get rid of those air pockets that might be there. And you're going to fill your jar until it gets to about an inch from the top of your jar. So you want to not fill it all the way to the top. You want to leave a little bit of headspace at the top. And then once you have your jar filled to about 1 inch from the top, and I'm going to fill a second smaller jar, then you want to give it a push down, and then any liquid that's still in your bowl, you're going to add it to your jars, or if you're using multiple jars, you're going to divide it between your jars. So all of that liquid gets added to our jars. And creating that liquid is really important because once we pack the kraut into our jars, we want the brine to come above the level of the kraut. And that's important because in order to have this ideal condition for our Lactobacillus bacteria, we want to create an anaerobic environment or an oxygen-free environment. And that's going to allow those lactic acid bacteria to flourish, and they're going to start to do that fermentation for us. And it's going to prevent any other type of microbe like yeast that could create mold from being able to survive. And so if you've got that anaerobic oxygen-free environment, you will not have any issues with mold. And I think that's one of the main keys to fermenting. I think a lot of people are worried about developing mold, and really it's creating that anaerobic environment that will prevent that. Now, I'm going to just take my jar up so it's a little bit closer so it's easier to see. So again, I've got the jar filled, so it's about an inch from the top. And if I push down on the jar, you can see how the liquid or the brine starts to come above the layer of the vegetables. And that's what we're looking for. So we want to have the brine be on top of the vegetables. Now, at this point, we are ready to take our reserved cabbage leaf, and we're going to take that clean cabbage leaf and pare off a little piece of it and place it on top of the kraut. And that creates a little barrier on top so that little stray pieces of cabbage from your kraut or a little piece of cucumber can't float on top of your brine. And once we've got that layer of cabbage on the top, now we need to put a weight on it because otherwise that brine's going to go down again, that level inside the jar. So we want to take a weight and place it on top. And there's lots of different options that you could use for a weight. Here I just have a smaller glass jar filled with water to make it heavier. And that actually fits right inside my fermenting jar. And then that weight, when I press down on it, takes the brine over top of the level of the kraut. And I'm just going to bring that up again so you can see what that looks like. So we've got our kraut, I've got my cabbage leaf on top, and then I have my weight. And if I push down on that weight, you can see how the brine rises to the top. And this is going to be what this looks like as it ferments. Now, there's also tools that you can use instead of the leaf and instead of the weighted jar. So if you are going to be fermenting regularly, one of the things that we really like are glass fermenting weights. This is what a glass fermenting weight looks like. There's several different brands that create them. And what can be really nice with these is that they act both like that cabbage leaf and as your weight. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1. So in the smaller glass jar here, I've got a wide mouth mason jar, and this is a wide mouth glass weight. And you can purchase these either for wide mouth or for narrow mouth mason jars. Once you've got your cabbage in there, you simply place the glass weight on top. And because it's designed to fit inside the diameter of that jar, you don't need the cabbage leaf as a barrier. The glass weight is doing that for you, and it's cut to be heavy so that you can then just have your glass weight inside, which is really convenient. And again, I'll just bring that up to show you. So that glass weight is inside, and if I press down on it, it lifts the brine up over top of the cabbage. Now, at this point, our kraut is going to be set aside at room temperature to ferment. So this stays out. And I would definitely recommend that if you are a newer fermenter, that you put it somewhere where you will see it every day. So wherever your mug is for your drink that you have in the morning, or your glass that you use for your glass of water, you want to set your Krauts right there so that you remember to check on them daily. And what you're checking for as it ferments is that brine is staying above the level of your Kraut. And if it's not, if your brine has sunk down to the bottom, then you're going to press down on your weight to help to lift the brine back up to cover the Kraut. The other thing that you're also going to want to do, because you still have salt acting to continue to pull more water out of the vegetables, you will likely over the next day or so have more brine be released, because the salt's going to continue to pull water from the cabbage and water from the cucumber. So what we usually recommend is taking like a shallow bowl or a baking dish and placing your Kraut inside of it so that it catches potentially any overflow of brine, just so you don't end up having a puddle somewhere. And then in terms of how long it's going to take for it to ferment, it really depends on the temperature of your home. So warmer temperatures will make fermentation happen faster up to a certain point, whereas cooler temperatures will slow fermentation down. So really, I think it's tasting the ferment as you go to know when it's done. So typically what you're going to see is after a few days, when you look inside your jar, you're going to start to see little bubbles, and that's carbon dioxide. Because as those lactic acid bacteria are taking those sugars from the vegetables and turning it into lactic acid, they're also making carbon dioxide. And so you're going to start to see this bubbling action. And if you press down on your weight, you'll see all of these bubbles come up. And that's a really great sign. You know that fermentation is happening and is active. The other thing that you're going to start to see after a few days is the color is going to start to change a little bit. As the pH goes down, because the lactic acid is going to make it become more acidic, and as that pH goes down, you're going to start to see some of those bright colors oxidize a little bit. So that bright green dill is going to start to look a little bit more olive-y. Your brine is going to start to get a little bit more cloudy. So instead of it being this kind of very bright and then clear brine, it's going to start to look a little bit duller in its color, and the brine's going to start to become cloudy as it gets full of microorganisms and that pH changes, and that's totally normal. You're also going to start to smell fermentation. You're going to start to smell that lactic acid. And if I smell it now, all I smell is the vegetables and the dill. But come day 4, day 5, I'm going to start to smell that acidity, that sour flavor or that sour tang in the air. Now, for me, generally in our home, I start to, based on the temperature of our house, taste the ferment around day 5 or 6. And to do that, all you'll do is remove your weight. If you have your cabbage leaf, you lift it up, take a fork, and give it a little taste. What you're looking for is for it to taste pleasingly sour. And you want that acidity to develop because it's that acidity that's ultimately going to preserve your Kraut. So if you end up stopping that fermentation process too quickly and you haven't developed enough acidity, then you're going to potentially get mold when you store the Kraut because it's not acidic enough to prevent mold growth. And so that's something that's important. You want enough acidity to develop. Once it's got that pleasingly sour flavor, then what we want to do is kind of slow that ferment down so that we retain that amount of sourness and flavor that we like. So once it's got that tang that you like, if you've got your cabbage leaf, you'll remove your cabbage leaf, and then you'll put a lid on the top, and then it gets transferred into your fridge for long-term storage. Once it goes into the fridge, those colder temperatures in the fridge really slow that fermentation down. It's still very slowly fermenting in your fridge, but you've slowed it down. So you kind of help to hold on to that amount of sourness that you like and the amount of crunch that you still have in the vegetable. Left in the fridge, it can safely stay there for months until you consume it. But because it is still slowly fermenting, it is going to get more acidic, and that acid's going to continue to break down the vegetables, making them softer and less crunchy. So ideally for me, when I've made a kraut like this, I try and consume it within 2 to 3 months so that it still has that crunchiness. But it's still perfectly fine to eat after that. So if I do have a jar of kraut that I find in the back of the fridge and it's been in there for several months and it's gotten too soft, then I might use that and add it to my soups or my stews, because there it doesn't matter if that cabbage is soft. Or I sometimes actually dehydrate it, especially things like my fermented pickles or my fermented beets, and I then grind it into a powder that I use as a seasoning when I'm cooking. So there's all kinds of creative ways to continue to use a batch of kraut that's maybe fermented for too long and gotten too soft. But in general, I usually recommend trying to eat them within the first few months that they're in the fridge. So questions at this point in terms of where we're at with putting the kraut into jars?
I have one question here. Does it have to go in the fridge, or can it be stored in a pantry?
Oh, good question. So because it is going to continue to ferment, once it's finished fermenting, so we leave it at room temperature until it's finished fermenting, we have enough of that acidity that's developed, and then we want to put it in the fridge to slow that fermentation down. That helps to keep the flavor that you like. And also because it is still continuing to ferment, once we put a lid on the jar, we're then trapping in the carbon dioxide that's being created. So if I had a tight lid on this jar, that carbon dioxide is going to build, and that pressure could eventually crack the jar, which is why you want to put ferments once they're finished, your krauts, into the fridge. It slows that fermentation down so that you can safely have the lid on top in the fridge without worrying about that carbon dioxide building up. You can, however, keep the kraut at room temperature and just continue to eat it as it ferments and never store it. So some fermenters might have a batch of kraut that they're fermenting, and they just continue to scoop out and eat it until the jar is done, and they leave it at room temperature fermenting the whole time. And typically those are people who don't mind if the kraut's starting to become really acidic or it's starting to really soften up. That's totally fine. But you just want to then make sure that you're allowing that carbon dioxide to continue to escape. There are methods of using things like, this is called a pickle pipe. And what a pickle pipe does is it can sit on top of your jar, and then you can put a lid on it. And that pickle pipe actually has a little hole in it. It's a little nipple, and that allows the carbon dioxide to escape. So you don't need to worry about pressure in the jar. Otherwise, if you just had a lid on the jar and it was at room temperature fermenting, you would need to burp the jar. You just need to open it to allow that carbon dioxide to release. In terms of, though, keeping it out at room temperature, what's going to tend to happen is you're going to have evaporation of your brine, especially if it's dry in your home. And as soon as we have that evaporation, now we can have yeast land on top that could create mold on the top. If you have mold that happens on top of your kraut, that's probably a sign that your brine was no longer covering it. Or maybe you stored your kraut in the fridge and it wasn't acidic enough to prevent mold from forming on top, even once it was in the fridge. So if that happens, generally, my kind of motto is, under the brine, everything is fine, which means that if I were to have mold happen on top of a ferment, I'm going to scoop out the mold. I'm going to scoop away any of the ferment that's gotten a little bit discolored. I'm going to wipe the jar thoroughly, and then anything underneath that brine, I'm going to eat because it's perfectly fine. So mold cannot form in that anaerobic environment. It would only be something that's on the surface. Everything underneath would be perfectly fine. So you can just scrape away, and that's not a problem at all. Okay, any other questions?
We do have another question. Should the jars not be covered while fermenting on my counter? For example, to prevent insects, etc., from getting into it. Second question, it's a two-part question. Do you want to answer that one first?
No, go ahead, do the second part.
Okay. Sometimes mold is not always visible right away. What should I look for that would indicate that the kraut has spoiled?
Okay, so if you have fruit flies or other insects in the house, when it's out fermenting, you can simply place a clean cloth over top. And that allows the carbon dioxide to continue to escape, but it doesn't allow fruit flies or dust or anything else to get in. So just a clean cloth over the top works really well for that. If your weight fits inside the jar, so you don't have the weight sticking up over the top, you could very loosely put a lid on top of the jar. So that might mean that you're not closing it all the way so that the gas can still escape, or you're having to just remember to burp the jar, and that can also be a way to keep things out. But we just want to remember to release that carbon dioxide as it ferments. For mold that's developing, again, mold will only form where things are exposed to the air. So if when you're fermenting, let's say you forget to check your kraut for a couple days and your brine level has gone down and you see that that stuff that was at the top was exposed to air. If you're worried that it could have been a few days, then you'll just scoop up what was on the top exposed to the air, push down again on your weight, let your brine come up to submerge everything, and then continue to let it ferment until it's done. Thanks, Jen. Okay, so in terms of our kraut, so once it's finished and you've put it in the fridge, one of my recommendations is to think about how you can integrate fermented foods into your diet more regularly. One of the things that we know is that in terms of fermented foods, we derive the most benefit from them when we're consuming them regularly. So this might mean thinking about how we can add fermented foods to our daily meals. And for me, I really like creating a lot of different types of fermented vegetables. So today we've created a kraut, and of course you could be so creative with this. There's so many different flavors that you can add to krauts. There's so many different directions that you can take it so that it's really the flavor profile that you're excited about. And you could think about adding a scoop of that kraut to a salad that you're making. You could think about chopping it and adding it into, let's say, a wrap or some type of, I don't know, sandwich that you're making. You could also put a little scoop of kraut on top of a soup or a stew for some freshness or some crunch. But you want to think about different ways that you can add it regularly to your meals. And then for me, I really like to create a big variety of fermented foods. So we make garlic paste, we make fermented chili paste, we make vinegars, we make kefir, we make kombucha, we make misos, and we make a large variety of different fermented foods. So it becomes really easy to add them to things because we have so many different ones to choose from. And one of the things that's really incredible, and this is something that we get into in the continuing ed course, is different types of fermented foods will support different types of microbes, and different types of microbes might be beneficial for specific conditions. So one example for that is that with kombucha, we're making a lot of different types of acids that have a really strong anti-inflammatory effect, which has been found to be really beneficial for people who have joint inflammation. So that could be a way of thinking about a targeted type of fermented food specific to that condition. And so when we have a large variety of fermented foods, we're starting to get all of these different benefits because different types of fermented foods will support different microbes, they'll make different types of acids, so they might be beneficial for different types of conditions. And so, ferment often, ferment a variety of things, and consume those ferments. And that's really fantastic ways to make sure that we're getting that benefit, not only of the probiotics, but also the nutrients that they help to pre-digest and the nutrients that they create. One of the things that's really incredible in this kraut, this like really simple kraut, is that we're also retaining the vitamin C that's in those vegetables, where if we weren't fermenting them, as soon as you pick that cucumber, as soon as you pick that cabbage, that vitamin C starts to degrade. But when you ferment it, the vitamin C is retained, which is just, again, so wonderful for thinking about getting through the months where things aren't in season. We're also making new nutrients. So through this fermentation process, these lactic acid bacteria are going to make B vitamins for us. And so that benefit of the nutrients that we also create via fermentation is another really wonderful benefit. So, we really are making a super food when we take anything and we ferment it. Now, in terms of including fermented foods in the diet, I would recommend starting slow. If you don't regularly consume fermented foods already, then start with a small amount. And when we're talking about something like a sauerkraut, even a few spoonfuls of a sauerkraut will have billions of probiotic organisms in them. So a small amount in terms of that transitory benefit, in terms of stimulating the immune system, a small amount is enough to be therapeutic. Once you start to consume fermented foods more regularly, you can start to increase the amount of fermented foods that you're eating. And one of the things that's really interesting in the research is when we regularly consume larger amounts of fermented foods, this is when we actually start to see shifts in our own gut microbiome. So that resident kind of population of microbes that you have within your body, they're very resistant to change. And we really set that microbiome that we have very early in life. And it tends to have that set population that it has, and it's difficult to change it. But we can create shifts in that set population through the regular consumption of fermented foods. So for me, I just think it's such a wonderful health addition. And I really love learning how to do it ourselves, because if we are comparing this to store-bought, for one, a lot of commercially produced fermented foods are sometimes not even fermented. They might actually be pickled. And certainly if we're going to a kind of a mass grocery store, like one of the chains, typically a lot of the quote unquote fermented types of foods that you see will actually have vinegar. So they'll be pickled, they might be pasteurized. If we're looking at things like dairy, it's often done with, of course, pasteurized dairy products and then a proprietary blend of organisms. Similarly for kombucha, it's often not a wild fermentation, but a proprietary blend. And also, they're so expensive when we buy them. If I think about how much it costs to make this, organic sauerkraut, it cost me a couple dollars. If I was buying this from a farmer's market, or if I was getting a real fermented kraut, it would start to become cost prohibitive. And so certainly learning how to ferment your own foods, being able to teach other people how to ferment foods is just such a wonderful thing to do, because the health benefits are really incredible and you keep the costs down. And it's so much more fun because then you can experiment with your own flavors and make things that you're really excited about eating, because you don't get a benefit if you're not going to actually eat it. Okay, any questions on fermentation in general or the health benefits of fermented foods?
Okay. I think this is it. I had my fermented carrots and onions in mason jars, and I've had them in the refrigerator for the last 6 weeks, and there is some white stuff settled at the bottom of the jar. Is that mold?
It is not. If you remember me saying that when we ferment, that brine is going to start to get a little bit cloudy. And some of that cloudiness, once it starts to settle, will sink to the bottom of the ferment. And that's often beneficial yeast. So not the yeast that we're trying to avoid that can create mold, but some of the beneficial yeasts that are created through fermentation. And because those yeasts are bigger than the bacteria, they'll often kind of clump together and then settle to the bottom. And that's absolutely normal. And one of the things that I think is really incredible, especially if you've made these fermented carrots and onions, is you've probably got a really tasty brine. So once you finish eating the carrots and the onions, use that brine. And certainly, like, there's people who like to do brine shots, and that still has a lot of probiotic organisms in it for you. You also benefit from those anti-inflammatory acids. I'm not a big fan of brine shots. They're a bit intense for me, but I love to use them to flavor dressings. You could also use them as something that you add to like a soup or a stew for a little brightness and acidity, but definitely make sure that you reserve that. We also like to keep a lot of our brines to then use in other types of fermentation. So for example, one of the things that we'll cover in the Con Ed course is making your own fermented condiments. So for me, when I hear carrot and onion brine, I think about making my own mustard and using that brine as the Kickstarter to make my own fermented mustard. So lots of ways to also use the brine in other types of fermentation.
Wonderful. And we have another great question from Anita. What veggies can we ferment?
Good question, Anita. Almost any vegetable can be fermented. And that's one of the things that's really remarkable about vegetable fermentation. It is inherently safe. So as long as you're creating that anaerobic environment underneath the brine, everything is fine. There's other types of fermentation where it requires a little bit more specific in terms of microbes. Certainly we'll get into that in the course as well. Some of them are a little bit more finicky, but vegetable fermentation is so inherently safe. Now, that being said, some vegetables, if they are sweeter, will tend to ferment faster because there's more sugar content in them. So certainly things like peppers, if you're doing like a hot sauce, because there's a higher sugar content and that makes the bacteria like really feed quite quickly, that can also sometimes create more issues with mold and certain types of yeast that can build. And one that's very common on sweeter vegetable ferments is calm yeast, which is harmless, but it changes the texture and it's not very pleasing. So higher sugar ones might require just some little bit of tweaking. Again, that's something that we would cover in the course, but generally we do more salt. We also do a couple things in terms of that, like time when it's fermenting, just to make sure that we're not allowing that mold to develop. Other types of vegetables that are sometimes just a little bit trickier to ferment is if the water content is very, very high. So certainly something like potato or onion or tomatoes, they can be a little bit more finicky to ferment. So those though will work really well if they're mixed with other things. So it's really easy to take tomatoes and onions and turn them into more of like a salsa or a relish and then ferment that. They don't always ferment very well on their own, but I'm a big fan of experimentation. So you can always try it. And if it fails, you just know that it fails. Certainly, I've given lots of things a go. Like kale doesn't really ferment very well. It just kind of turns into mush, but you can dehydrate that mush and turn it into a fermented seasoning spice. And those antioxidants in the kale will be more bioavailable because you fermented them. So there's lots of different ways to experiment and play. Good question.
Now, one more question here, Kathrin, I have is, how then would you store the brine?
So typically I keep my brine stored in the fridge and I just label them. So I'll just say if it's a brine from example, let's say the Dilly Kraut, or if I've made some, let's say some ginger, asparagus spears or something like that. I'll just write on the jar what was in the brine so I remember what the flavor profile is, and that brine will keep indefinitely. it's very acidic. It's like vinegar. So you can store it for a very, very long time. And then I just add it to recipes, or I use it again to kickstart condiment fermentations as needed.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's it for questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks
So-
everyone. And,
Yeah.
and I hope your ferments turn out tasty. And of course, like most of you have my contact information. So if you end up having questions as it's fermenting, if you're not quite sure if things are looking right, you're welcome to send an email, and I'm happy to coach you through that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. You got lots of compliments and thank yous in the chat box. So your upcoming Con Ed course, your continuing education course, is called Fermentation Foundations, and you can attend it live and work along with Kathrin, but there will also be a recording. So you will be able to access that as well. So that you can sign up for on the Institute of Holistic Nutrition website. And that's it.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Jen, for hosting.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and happy fermenting.
Bye.
Bye.